Alrighty, the clock says 0. So it is time to jump into the final segment, the final countdown. Okay, screen one, share. So there are two things I'm going to be covering in this section. The first of which is going to be optimization. So we're going to be looking into the profiler that's built into Notch. And that's going to give us an overview of which of our nodes are chewing the most resources and how we can best trim those down. The second thing we're going to be doing is looking at how to expose parameters for media servers. And what I have in front of me now is the Notch Web GUI, which allows us to play with exposed nodes. So inside the TV complete version we have, I've already gone through and exposed a bunch of parameters. Things like the input selector here. If I click on this question mark right here, I can then click on expose parameter, property, type the name in here and type a group name. And what that will do is over here, where we've had our nodes list this whole time, there are actually other tabs. The exposed tab will then let me come in and say, all right, here is my list of exposed parameters, and then I can change things here. One of the really good ways of doing this is if you're making an Notch block for things like standalone, and this is running full screen, you don't have a UI to change anything. So if you actually load up a web page, and now we've got this enabled, it should be enabled on your system as well. If you type the address 127.0.0.1:8910, that is the default port that Notch uses. In a browser, this should bring up what is currently running, and you're running Notch at the same time on the same machine. This will bring up all the options that I've exposed for the two looks. So for a quick through here, I can come in and say, I want the Truchette look to be green. I want to have the marble color be purple. I want to have a hue shift on my TVs. I want the distortion to stop jittering on the TV screens. And then I can come in and say, like, I need a little bit of turbulence on the TVs, and I want to switch it back across to the looks. And all of this happens completely independently of Notch. It's basically this standalone block, if we set it up properly, looks for commands from this web GUI, which is really cool. So now we've messed with all of that. Let's start talking optimization. Now, the complete version here is quite optimized. The one we built just before, maybe not so much. So let's jump back into there. Mine is the TV blank, or whichever scene you've been building it in. So I am currently getting, if I unlock my frame rate, enough frames. So I don't need to worry too much about what's going on here. We're not really struggling it. But say if I wanted to make this run at 4K, now I'm starting to drop. I'm getting into the 49s and the 30s when I really should be seeing 60 for this particular machine. What the Notch has built into it that's really useful is if we go to our nodes list and we come across one tab here is our profiler. If I enable a profile by clicking enabled, what it will do is it will start running. Let's just bring this a bit bigger, and it will show me all the nodes and processes that are running. And anything that's red is going to start flagging me and say, hey, look, I'm using a lot of processing power. All right. And this is telling me at the moment, my screen space reflection. So if I click on this, I believe if I press A, it'll actually center on the screen space reflection. And I can see in Notch, while this profile is running, that this is using a lot of resources. That's 11 milliseconds itself, just whenever it's doing whatever it is. So that's intense. We don't need it to do that much. So why is this using so many resources? Well, we can say, like, our step size, like drop that all the way down, maybe our depth bias, but we're really going to find that we're feeding it in an 8K map. So we can probably drop that down a bit as well. So everything's going to run a lot smoother when the profiler is off. Maybe if we jump into our hologram, might be a good one to optimize. And F1 enabled. Oh, it's not showing anything. Oh, there you go. Okay, so here's a good one. So the hologram look we built before, I am getting, again, because I'm running in 4K mode there, I'm getting a bunch of nodes that are really throwing issues. So I can say a lot of this is basically coming down to post-processing. But if we look again, while it's running, anything that's going to be really, really intensive will show up with like a value. I think the problem I have here is I've built a lot of this super efficient. So we're not going to run into a lot of things that really need a lot of optimizing. But that's the best way to flag anything that's going really bad. It'll come across here. It'll generally be shown as red. And then you can hunt it down and find things that aren't working really well. So if we were really, really worried, like the tilt shift earlier, we're talking about that node being really, really hungry. So if we come into our tilt shift, which I believe is here, if I put on the normal tilt shift amount and then enable, you'll see that this is actually using 40 milliseconds just to try and do the tilt shift. Let's drop it back down to 1080. Even at 1080, it's still using 7 milliseconds, which is acceptable, but not great. If you're running a laptop, that's really something you want to trim down. In comparison, if we use the blur mode, which we had before, instead of the other scaling mode, we only get 0.6. So this isn't an over, like a real in-depth way of you must go through and optimize everything, but that's probably the fastest way of saying where is the most amount of performance we can save. The next thing we can look at is textures. At the moment, like this gradient, I might say for the scene post effects, I've got a gradient running through this tilt shift. Now I can make this gradient stupidly huge and say like it's 1920 by 1080, but I've already dropped this down to something really small, like 256 by 256, or even 128 by 128. Because it's a blur, it's not going to be notified that much. And you can really start to shave off those tiny milliseconds there each time. The same thing with the fractal noise. That's running on the TV shell here, which is this blue or purple now material. I can probably drop this down to 128 by 128. And you're not going to notice that is a really, really small texture now. But the performance saving is going to be huge. That's 0.014 now. And I'm bringing it back up to say 5112, 512. All right, and that's 4 times as much. Sometimes jumping into like 0.1. So as much as you can, when it comes to this real-time sort of work, especially camera effects, try and shave all of your textures down to just as small before they start breaking apart. If this TV is all the way back here, you don't need a 4K texture on it to see it. It's just try and optimize as much as you can with the small features. Anything that can get away being smaller is great. Even here, we might say, look, we don't really need our videos to be 4K at this point. But if we're doing our video in player, we might be able to say, we're coming up, all right, if we're never going to use a full screen effect, we can come to our devices and then say, look, maybe let's take in 720p. You know, if you're really struggling against something that's hitting a frame rate cap, and camera work like this is always going to hit a frame rate cap. When you're working with IMAG looks, especially in live events, you're always going to want to lock your frame rate. So right now, I've got it open. Realistically, I'd want to hit 60-60 for North America. If you're in a PAL region, some cameras still work on 50 frames a second. So then you do 50-50. And if you can't hit that, the next best option is to drop it down to half, so 30-30. But when you're locking that frame rate, you're getting a guaranteed signal out however many frames. So your cameras aren't going to start stuttering and you're not going to get desynced from there. If you're working with a media server, you'll actually have the ability to gen lock all of your sources, inputs and outputs to the same clock as the camera. So they will fire at the same time the camera shutter works. which is really, really useful. But we always want to try and hit that as high as we can, but the highest limit of that camera, if that makes sense. I really hope it does. Please hit me in chat if I'm just warbling on that. Okay, so optimization. We've covered most of the main parts there. Just try and shave everything off you can. Even 3D models. This TV could probably be like a lot more refined if I went back into something like 3ds Max and changed the topology so it wasn't so smooth. I could probably shave, another quarter of a second off there. All right, so we've looked at those nodes. We've looked at how to optimize. Now let's look at how to expose parameters. Now, I'm going to say, everyone, at this point, let's do a save of this project because we're going to delete a bunch of things. So let's do a save. And then I'm going to say, let's do a save as. So save as, and let's just call this expose. Now, the reason I'm saying let's do this is I'm going to delete all of the values in the exposed column here. I believe, delete. Okay. So now everything that was previously covered in here is now no longer so. So how do we start connecting things together? I'm going to go back to the one we've built together, which was definitely not that look, and definitely this one. And we can turn off profiler. So again, before I was saying envelopes are really, really useful. So if we come back to our node group, env envelope. Let's say I wanted to expose the amount this beat pulse moves. I could directly come in here and expose the scale here. But I would always say, if you're going to expose something to a media server, expose it under an envelope. And in the envelope options, come in here under operation, change it from add to multiply. Now we drag this in to scale. 0 will be 0 in here, and 1 will be whatever value is in here. Because I might say I want that scale to be 3, and that's still going to be that multiplier. Let's bring it back to 1. Here, I would probably say something like F5, ENV for envelope, and then say beat pulse. I spelled that incorrectly. Beat pulse with an S. Okay, so if I want to expose this, I'm going to go to my envelope, click on it, find the value I want to expose, which is value, and click on this little question mark in the corner here. That's going to bring up the properties. Now, there's an option here for expose property. We click on this, and we can now say, what do we want to call the value? I'm going to call this camera beat. Yep. What group do we want to put this under? Now I'm going to call this TV underscore IMAG. Now this group is basically how we can put everything from one layer into one section in the exposed parameters. Now if I click OK and come across to our exposed values, I now have one TV IMAG value 0. Cool. Now, how do we access that? So again, before we were talking about that web GUI. All right, the way we set that up is by coming into our project settings, I believe. Yep, project settings, so the cog with a smaller cog next to it. And if this is not enabled for you, there is a checkbox next to web GUI enabled. Click that. And now we are going to be opening up this port on our computer. By default, it is 8910. And if we bring in, we basically can dial into this computer and for that port, bring this up. So if I refresh here, this is what's exposed, my camera beat. Now, if you're on another network, you can then target this particular PC. So if you were to basically do an IP config and find out which PC is running your Notch blocks, you can then from another computer, ping that machine with its IP here. Again, we're still looking for the port 8910, but you can log in on a remote machine and adjust all the values. If you really wanted to, you could have something like an iPad or a tablet on the machine, on the network that's on Wi-Fi, and you could control, again, these values from that if you're out and about. So we've got our beat. That's not too bad. Let's maybe start looking at something a bit more complex. Let's start exposing things like colors. So we've got our color ramp here. Again, like sometimes when we're exposing colors, we need to work like fully exposing the red, the green, the blue, the alpha. No, nothing like that. We just click the question mark, we expose it, and let's call this TV to col. And again, TV underscore IMAG. Bringing up our project again, just refresh it. And here we go. We have a complete color picker. That easy. And the cool thing with this is, if I've adjusted it inside of this web GUI and then I save Notch, when I boot it up again, that same color will be adjusted. So it's really good if you are going to be using this on a tablet or something and you need to move around your space and color correct things or change things, or maybe you might find that, apologies, you might find that this movement looks okay on a small screen, but when you're in front of a 40-foot high TE, that motion is just far too intense. So it's a good idea to expose values you think you're going to need access to at runtime. Definitely don't expose everything, because your media server engineer is just going to be hunting through endless lists. But it's definitely good to expose things like colors here, speeds or intensities of effects that you may want to turn on and turn off, and anything regarding like switches. So like this sort of multiplex switch here, which we can definitely do. So let's bring in an envelope. So nodes again, envelope. We want to control the source index. So drag on the out. Now in this one, we're not going to do a multiplier because it's already going to be from 0 to 1. As long as we set that to 0, our envelope is going to go from 0 to 1 anyway. Now the downside to this is it needs to be at 1 to be recognized. And sometimes the web GUI can be a little finicky about just hitting at 0.99 and not quite getting there. So a node that's really good if you need to do a 1 or a 0 is called the quantize modifier. So link the output of the envelope into a quantize and link that into your source index. And this will do at the halfway mark, it'll kick it straight across. So if we go to 0.5, then it goes around. So it's just going to make everything round up. And at 0.5, it's going to round it up to the next one. So think of it like a ceiling node. Cool. All right. So this is probably not the most in-depth way of exposing blocks and doing things, but it's the first taste. And we are on a little bit of a time crunch. So I'm trying to push through a bit more. So we've got a few minutes for questions. Now, to export these blocks, what's going to happen when you export a Notch block? It's going to export all of these, everything that's in here, and it's going to automatically kick into the first one. So realistically, if we were going to export this block, we would say maybe take our complete hologram, move that to the top, our complete TVs, move that one down. And if we wanted to really optimize this block, we would delete all of these other nodes. We're just going to keep them in here for now. So what do we do at this point? All right, let's say we want to export to a media server. The process for doing that is actually pretty easy. We just have our nodes we're using, file, project, and compile block for media server. What we do here now is say, where do we want this block to be? I put an IMAG workshop, and let's call this Notch block IMAG workshop. Incorrect spelling, but whatever works. And that's going to take a couple of seconds, maybe a little bit longer. And that's just going to compile everything that's in this thing down to all of our exposed parameters and ready to run. Now, I haven't done this correctly, but there is definitely a way to play Notch blocks and test them before handing them out. I should have had this earlier prepared. It's inside of the Notch directory somewhere. And I think the Interactive Immersive HQ team did a video on it on YouTube. So have a look for that. They'll be able to definitely show you how that works. So that's that one there. Another way of running these, instead of compiling it for a block inside of Touch Designer or a media server, is to compile for standalone. And again, project up the top here, compile for standalone. So I'm going to come in here, choose where it's going to go, and I'm just going to say standalone IMAG workshop. Okay. Now this is going to build it as a standalone exe. So this won't need a media server to run. It'll just run by itself. It will require a playback license or a builder license that will run as playback. So because I'm on the builder base license, I can't playback unwatermarked files. But if I was in the builder pro, I could. So let's bring in, why am I behind? Oh, because that's screen sharing. Okay. So I'm just going to launch this standalone exe on a different folder. Here we go. So it's basically going to say, when I launch this, what is it? Okay, it's going to be running on my GPU. Which resolution? Let's set a resolution. Which display is it going to be? Display 1. Do I want full screen? Do I want VSync? Do I want however it works? And if there's any audio, set it there. At which point, I'm going to click run. It's going to ask me for access. And it's going to take probably like 30 seconds or so to boot in, because it's just got to recompile all of the shaders like it normally does at the start of launching a file. But the cool thing is we can still use that web UI we built earlier. And here's that watermark. Again, watermarked playback license. So if I come in, bring in this. Now, the really big advantage of running a block or a standalone is we can actually jump between the layers. Oh, this is still running in Builder. Okay. So if Builder was disabled, I could jump between these layers in here and select which one's running. But because I have Builder running open, this is actually still referencing that, I believe. Yeah. Okay. Well, that was fun while it lasted. So escape to get out. So what have we covered? I'm just going to do a quick wrap up here. I drifted a bit off script for that last one, but our hologram look, this is what we were aiming to get to. And what we got was, well, that's me, but what we got was fairly close. So we've got it pushing forward. We've got our cloners, our post effects. We learned how to use our cloned image and our clone effectors to really distort where our images were. One thing for optimization for this, we could definitely come into our spheres and change it from 20 per side to something like 4 per side. And we're going to get a quick jump in performance there. Let's set this back to 60. Okay. Then we wanted to jump into our second look. This is kind of what we were going for. We ended up here. Slightly fewer post effects on there and far less on the distortion on the screens. But that same process we had in line was where we were going. So put everything in, put it on a video null so it only affects that particular layer. And then you can run and affect it from there. And the first part we were talking about, we're just going through like how we were doing the basics for IMAG. And yeah, I'm pretty close to most of the things I wanted to cover. If there were any other questions. If not, I can definitely stick into this and keep refining it a lot further. All right, while I wait to hear back. So some of the other looks, actually, I might even dive into that. Some of the other looks that I've worked on. Where did you get your 3D objects, Mike Love? Okay, my 3D object, I just made this in 3ds Max. It's really rough. It was a box and some Boolean subtractions that are just smoothed out. So that's how I do my models. Turbo Squid is a really good place to get models. If you're using any humanoids, definitely check out Mixamo. All of those will come straight in and their animations work great. The reason I personally like 3ds Max is just because that's what I've been using for 10 years. And I find it's got a really good UV baking system, so I can get all of my textures to all line up really well. So that's where I get my models and how I deal with that. Okay, so I'm going to see if I have some of my other projects in here. We can step through maybe some of the looks I use live. Where are we at? IMAG Red Room. Okay, I'm just going to stop the share right now, and I'm just going to jump into one of my files. Yes. Apologies for the time this is going to take. I would love to share my screen right now, but I'm going to get called out for the amount of icons that are on my desktop because there are very few patches of non-icon screens. Come on, Notch. Hey, here we go. All right, so these are some of the files. Oh, wow, I've really zoomed in. These are some of the looks I use in the club. So the first one here is just a simple field system that's got a bit of delay on it. I have my transform punched in a long way because this camera is normally much further out. Much further out in the venue. So it's just good to be able to come in. And again, that's where that transform is really good to be able to just say, look, I want to be able to punch in on the camera or pull back out without having to reframe. Let's have a look at some of the other fun ones. The Game Boy. The Game Boy gets used a lot. And again, this is built around being further away. So yeah, we can take the model of a Game Boy again, separate the materials out. So one material is that screen. And then what we have here is 2 video inputs running through, some text between each one, and then a bunch of post effects, some color correction, some pixelate, and some recolor. And then we've basically just taken that, thrown it together, and that can run behind an artist. Another one that's using a 3D sort of look would be the turntables. So here, again, I am punched way further in, but we've taken the same idea of here is the material. We've just put it on the turntable platters. And now we are showing our artists run real time, like their DJs, on some turntables. This one, I'm not sure if it's actually going to work, but it's using the head tracking or face tracking that's built into Notch. So it'll actually follow me around left and right. What else do we have? This is the Pixels in Space, the one we just built. I'm just going to move my camera. That's me easier. Move my camera up. So that's the sort of look that I use, the final version I use in the venue. This one uses that Truchette look we had before, but actually switches between 2 images. This one will actually be mirrored, but you can do 2 camera feeds into this. This one's actually really cool with the amount of reflections that came in. A lot of that is screen space reflections. If I turn those off, we lose so much free detail. I generally run these ones at about 30 frames a second just because they can be a bit taxing on my machine. What else do we have? I'm just going to try and run some time out here. The good old classic security camera footage. So a little bit of jitter there, a little bit of ghosting, some glitches. This one is probably not the best to be here because I'm so close in, but it puts a bunch of glitched world, but it keeps your face sort of able to see. Again, this is designed for a darker nightclub, but if I want to come in here and quickly change it, I can bring my brightness down and it's much easier to see. And this is what I was saying before, is if you can keep all the values you need to change in an easy to find place, like right now, my transform, my color correction is easier to find here, and I can tweak that live. So right now I can have this on F9 or F10 running to a separate monitor, or as I run it on my shows, I run Notch, spout out into Resolume Arena, and then do my color correction and mapping from there. Thank you for continuous support. And can I contact you on Instagram after this lecture? I have more questions. Yeah, sure. Hit me up on Instagram. I try to post there quite a lot. I've been a little busy recently working on some other projects, so I've not been quite so active there. But yeah, hit me up on questions there. I'm generally fairly fast to respond. Give me a day. I might be in the middle of something, but definitely hit me up on there. It's probably the one place I will check messages the most. What else do we have in this look? Oh, this one might not work quite so well. So basically it's just a reflection of the water. Let's change the text, which was TDSW. So again, like building these looks, you can come in and as long as you've got something you can like quickly change, like a string here, you can go between DJs and between acts, just change names, change logos, make things work. A lot of these are actually tied into Resolume. What have we got here? Love the way you're block aligned. Hey, thank you. When I try to keep a lot of my stuff for Instagram in the square. This is really good for presentation, but it's not really good for logic and workflow. The way we've done it before, we're actually stretching it out wide, leaves a lot of room for commenting. And I think commenting, one of these might be the best. Nope. I would always say I'm really bad at doing it in these, my personal work files, but any file I've given away for a client, I've always really, really heavily commented it. Oh, this one's actually using audio. So this one will take an artist logo and it'll actually break the ground up based on the audio. TDSW feels happy. Hey, look, if you guys are happy, I'm so stoked that you guys brought me on for this. And again, I hope everyone's been getting something out of this. This is my first workshop I run, so I'm not going to lie. I was extremely nervous last night when my computer packed it in, and I hope I've delivered something that you can use for sure. But yeah, so this is how I use my looks. This one's just motion detection. And I'll use these not only just standalone, I'll use these alongside of pre-rendered footage as well. So it's just another layer, another tool you've got. Where's my IMAG segments? This is one that gets used a lot for bass music. So I'm not sure if I can actually fire it up, but all of these are running slow at the moment, but they are beat synced into Resolume. And I will be throwing up a YouTube video on how to link Resolume and Notch for parameter control and for BPM sync as well, sometime in the near future. What is this one? So this is a really cool one, actually. So the way this functions is there is actually a post effect called Voronoi post. And what it'll do is it'll actually shatter the entire image based off a particle system. So if I turn my particles off, if I put, like, say, the emitter much bigger, the fractures will go sort of all over the place. But if I keep those fractures small, so imagine what it's doing is breaking the camera effect up, but the particle is like one center of all the cracks. So that's a really, really simple one. Like, I can probably build this one for you. We've got 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Okay, we're going in. So this one's going to be a bit of a freebie. So insert layer. Let's just call this cracks. Cool, F1. All right, so let's just go real quick on this. We're going to do a video in node. I'm going to probably talk a bit fast. Video in. Okay, it's going to pick up our camera from what we have. I'm going to go to a image 2D, which is going to fill our screen. I'm going to go to a video null, link. Cool, I'm in here. We're going to put a threshold on so I can get that nice color to black and white. Oh, a couple of questions. Is Notch difficult to work with in Ableton or Touch Designer? I use Touch Designer pretty much to run OSC through until I found out that the Pro and the commercial versions will actually run Notch blocks. So if you have a commercial or a professional version of Touch Designer, you can actually export those Notch blocks we built. And anything you've exposed can actually be like immediately natively linked into Touch Designer. It's really, really cool. So Remy, thank you. Mike, this made me realize I can run Notch directly to my Barco E2 for IMAG walls. Yeah, so if you run standalone, you can run that just on another machine. You can run that on like a high-powered laptop or a media server without having to run it inside of something like D3, if that's what's going to be. And once you've exported that block, you will need the Builder Pro license to export. But once you've got that block exported, you'll just need the playback license to run it. Okay, jumping quickly back in here. Let's see if I can get this going. Particle root. So the particle system, you need to use this. You need to drag a root out, and the particles are all orange. What we also need to do here is, I'm just going to do it this way. Particles, we need to make a generator. So an emitter, let's just go a primitive emitter. Cool, in. Now we can't see anything here. If we go point render, and oh, the image 2D is in front of it. So basically, this is basically generating a heap of points. We don't need that many points. Let's go to 64 points. Okay, put our image back on and Voronoi post-process. What we do now is feed in our particle system and we've got it going. So realistically, we could lose that null, throw it in threshold, throw it in image 2D. So in 6-7 nodes, this look works. Like, so that's what I mean by I love Notch, because it's crazy fast how quickly we can just turn these things around. Let's say we only want 8 particles. So there we go. Like in 10 minutes, we made this simple look here. If we want to really dive into the Voronoi post process, we can say like, you know, let's make the amount bigger. Let's make the crack amount larger, like the distortion really crazy, and chromatic aberration nuts. There you go. So jumping into things on site in Notch is fun. Like creating stuff in Notch now is fun. I'm an artist first. I'm not a programmer first. So I was really scared by Touch Designer until I really dove into it. But Notch, I find, is more of a playful tool for me. And it's fast. It is quite expensive sometimes when you look at it that way. But when you take into account the amount of time it takes you to make things, it is an extremely efficient and it's worth every cent. I can make a bank of visuals out in Notch, render them out in half a day when it would have taken me a week in some other offline renders. Cheers, Remy. But yeah, like I've just been slowly building up like libraries. Here's the one there. So that's the one that gets used in the venue. Slowly building up looks, and you might find some looks work better for some artists. Some looks might work better for certain music. Some looks might work better in certain BPMs, or, you know, just keep playing. Eventually you're going to find something that works. Oh, this was the original look that sort of started the TV sort of glitch. Not sure if this one will actually show. Oh yeah, some reaction diffusion. Cool. All right. I might throw it back to the TDSW crew if no one has any more questions. But this has been fun. I hope you guys got something out of this.
Thank you so much. There are any questions from audiences?
Oh, Mike Love's got one question here. Does Voronoi work on 3D objects to make them mirror, shatter into shards and scatter off screen? So the post effect does not, no. However, there is, let's go into cracks. There is a Voronoi generator inside of our procedurals. So I'm just going to turn all of this off. Procedural. No. Procedural root. Here we go. Procedural root. Let's go our Voronoi in and a meshing node. So what you'll see here, it's really hard to see. Let's go skylight and deferred rendering. So this is actually breaking all those little chunks up right there. So if I wanted to come into my Voronoi and say, I wanted to make this much larger, and in my procedural meshing, I could say seal boundaries. So you can then break things up using the Voronoi field that way. What you're thinking of doing immediately shattering, that's something I would say you should do in your creation tool, like your modeling tool. I would go into something like 3ds Max or Cinema 4D, apply your Voronoi shatter there, then bring an FBX model into Notch. And then you can definitely, from that point, go in and mess around. So I'm going to go Vimeo. One thing I built a long time ago, I think it was last year, that was kind of useful, actually drag this off, was the Know Your Nodes series. So it's a way of, I just got really, really lost one time in Notch and was wondering like, what's an efficient way of learning what nodes do what? And I think there's a link to this in the event page. So I went through and actually, I think you'll find Voronoi is in here. So I went and put a representation of what each node looks like, and then built in an effect to make it look like it was doing the effect it says it's supposed to do. Oh, thank you for the link. So yeah, throwing it back across.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, yeah, thank you so much. What we heard so interesting and awareness filled and enjoyable time. And actually, in personal idea, I am really familiar with Touch Designer, but not chance to know deeply about Notch. So, but this is so good opportunity for me to, yeah, try to Notch and create effects, like create interesting effects like you. Thank you so much.
No worries. Like I love Touch Designer. I think it's a fantastic data translator, but I'm horrible at trying to get materials to work in Touch.
I'm horrible too.
So what I use is like I can build the nice looking thing in Notch, and then I can take all of the sensors and the data and all of the really cool math stuff you can do inside of Touch Designer and then feed it directly. It's really exciting where that's going, is that collaboration.
Yeah, I remember your message today. Okay, thank you. And yeah, thank you for joining TDSW today. And before closing,
Yuki, you got a question in the chat.
Oh, I do.
Okay.
In Japanese.
Okay, Matthew, please tell us about the media server. オフィスでの制作環境。Okay, Harada-san, please translate correctly about this question.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, attendee ask you about your setup in your studio. I mean, your PC or any spec or those kind of stuff, and also, so you want to know what kind of media server you use in your production.
Okay, I am going to see if I've got. I actually deleted this out of the PowerPoint, so I'm going to see if I can throw it across quickly. I have an older X99 Intel motherboard machine. It's not a media server per se. It's just a tower I've built with a 2080 Ti in it. I think it's an 8-core CPU. It's got about 64 gig of memory. It's nothing extreme. I've got an actual image I will throw across in a second that shows exactly what does what. Here we go. Control C. But yeah, what we do is we run Resolute Marina and Notch on the same machine just via Spout, and it seems to work pretty well for us. We do get a little bit of latency. One of the other people asked about latency in the Notch group, so I'm going to answer that one quickly. Latency is pretty crazy, but where are we at? What was that called? Notch. Everything's called Notch. Notch signal flow. Here we go. All right. So I'm going to share my screen quickly here. All right, so this is my signal flow when I work in the club. So I have a Marshall 506 camera, which is what's looking at me right now. I take the SDI feed out of that into a major role USB capture card, and that runs directly into Notch. So that feed gets processed inside of Notch, and I send a spout output from Notch, which is kind of like Siphon if you're on a Mac. Just basically takes the GPU reading buffer from one program and lets another program access it at the same time. So into spout, that then comes into Resolume Arena, where I do all of the mapping out to the wall. I have all of my BPM and all of my control settings happening in there via the Tractor S8, which is sitting there behind me, little dude sitting on top of it. That then goes out into a decimator, which converts it from HDMI into SDI, into the LED wall processor, and into the LED wall. So that's my setup for how I do all my projects. I think the question, if it was exactly for the computer itself, it's just a relatively high-end tower from maybe 2 years ago, and just with a faster GPU in there, the 2080 Ti, because Notch responds really well to a lot of graphics card performance, and not so much to super high-end CPUs. While your CPU will be really useful for speed, Notch is far more bound to the graphics card. So if you can put a fast graphics card in an older computer, Notch will probably run on it.
Okay,
That's a really long answer.
Yeah, so long sentence. So please, how split that?
Yeah. So to answer your question really, really simply, it is a tower PC with a fast graphics card. It is not an expensive media server. All right. Oh, raise hand, chat. Here we go too. Thanks. What an exciting diagram. Not quite as exciting. It's just a bunch of squares, but this is how we run. Like, you know, if you get to a festival stage, you might find that there's video switches in line. You might need to change a bunch of settings. You know, all of this will probably happen inside of the media server, inside of something like Disguise. So it won't need to go from Notch to Arena. It'll just be running the D3 system. And then that eliminates a lot of latency in there as well. Hope that answers.
Okay, thank you so much. 原田さん、翻訳いると思いますか？
いらないと思います。
はい。Thanks. Okay. 富田さん、are you okay to clear?
Mike, yes, at Ultra. Hey, you do awesome work. Front of house video engineer, run dual Barco E2s and 8 VJ stations. Yeah, the E2, if anyone's not familiar with it, is a fantastic switcher. Barco also make the smaller S3s as well, but the E2 is pretty beefy. 8 VJ stations, that's interesting. Yeah, so Mike, if you're running Ultra, you would be able to either get one media server with multiple outputs to handle your cameras, or you could use something like an Atom Mini like switcher to take multiple camera feeds in and then select that camera feed, take that in as a webcam feed into Notch and then process it there and then send it back out. You're probably going to get 4 to 5 frames at worst case scenario. But you can probably get it within 2 or 3 frames latency with that sort of setup. Okay, a couple more I can't quite understand. Or is that you answering the questions in chat?
Okay.